He had everything: money, power, status. But one rainy night, two strangers knocked on the door of his mansion and claimed to be his sons. What came next shattered everything he thought he knew about his past and forced him to face a secret that could save a dying woman or destroy the life he built. Evan Carter sat alone in his vast glass-walled living room, the soft hum of the city. Below, barely audible through the thick walls of his mansion, perched on the hills of San Francisco. The rain tapped rhythmically against the windows, streaking down in silver lines as the gray sky outside deepened into twilight. He held a glass of deep red Bordeaux in one hand and stared out over the cityscape, the twinkling lights stretching into the horizon like a promise he couldn't quite grasp anymore. At 35, Evan had everything he thought he wanted, more than most could ever dream of. CEO of one of Silicon Valley's fastest-growing tech companies, he had built his empire from scratch. His calendar was filled with investor meetings, keynote speeches, boardroom decisions that affected billions of dollars. Every magazine that mattered had featured him at some point: The Visionary Mind, America's Next Tech Titan, Forbes 40 Under 40. He had a personal driver, a full-time chef, 3 assistants who managed every moment of his waking life, and a sprawling modern home with Italian marble floors, custom lighting, rare art, and rooms he hadn't even walked into in months. He wore suits that cost more than most people's rent and flew private not because it was faster, but because he couldn't stand commercial airports anymore. But tonight, just like every other night lately, it all felt silent. He took another sip of wine and leaned back into the leather couch, his eyes unfocused as he stared into the distance. The fire flickered low in the minimalist fireplace, casting warm golden light against the sleek interior. Everything in his life was curated, precise, intentional, flawless, except the inside of him. Evan sighed and reached for his phone, scrolling through messages that didn't matter, faces on social media that didn't really know him. People envied him, admired him, even feared him in the business world, but no one truly knew him, not anymore. He had dated models, entrepreneurs, women who seemed perfect on paper, but it never lasted. The deeper he climbed into the corporate atmosphere, the farther away real connection drifted. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped trying, or maybe he had forgotten how. He set the phone down and closed his eyes, letting the rain's rhythm pull him deeper into his thoughts. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered a simpler time, before the boardrooms, before the buyouts and stock options, when his biggest joy was morning coffee in a small cafe near his first apartment. There had been a girl there. What was her name? He frowned slightly. It was so long ago. Her laugh had been soft, her eyes a shocking shade of blue. She used to draw little hearts on his coffee cup lids. He hadn't thought about her in years. He shook his head as if trying to dismiss the memory and stood up. He told himself he didn't need anyone. He had achieved greatness alone, and that was how it was supposed to be. But as he walked through his silent house, its halls echoing with every footstep, Evan felt a hollow ache grow inside him. He paused near the front door, glancing out at the driveway where rain slicked the cobblestones. The storm had grown louder, the wind rattling the glass. It was supposed to be just another quiet night, another evening of silence, luxury, and isolation. But what Evan didn't know, what he couldn't possibly have imagined, was that fate was already making its way up his driveway, and it was about to knock. The storm was in full swing now. Thunder rolled low across the hills as the wind howled through the trees outside Evan Carter's estate. The rain poured down in heavy sheets, painting the glass walls with streaks of water that shimmered like silver veins in the dim light. Inside, the warmth of the modern home created a strange contrast. Clean lines, designer furniture, glowing sconces, a fortress of comfort. Evan had just finished pouring himself another glass of wine when it happened. A knock. Sharp, solid, and utterly out of place. He froze. For a few moments, he thought he'd imagined it. No one ever just knocked on his door. Not here, not at this time, not in this weather. Anyone who knew him called ahead. Anyone else was met by the gate, the intercom system, the assistant, the cameras. Not this. Not the raw sound of someone's knuckles hitting solid wood in the middle of a storm. The knock came again, louder this time, urgent. Evan set the wine glass down slowly and moved to the front of the house. The hallway stretched ahead of him, dimly lit and lined with artwork. As he reached the door, a towering slab of dark wood framed by glass, he instinctively tapped the panel to check the security feed. But the storm had knocked out the exterior cameras. Another knock. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. Like a code. He hesitated only a second longer before unlocking the door. As he pulled it open, the cold wind rushed in, along with the sound of rain and the earthy scent of wet pavement. But that wasn't what stopped him in his tracks. It was them. 2 boys stood there, side by side. No umbrellas, soaked to the bone, their dark hair plastered to their foreheads. They wore matching blue hoodies and jeans, sneakers that squelched as they shifted their weight nervously. And their eyes, wide, deep brown, filled with something that looked like fear and hope all at once. Evan's heart stopped. They looked exactly like him. Not a little, not vaguely, exactly. As if someone had taken his childhood photographs and made them 3-dimensional. Same shaped eyes, same jawline. Same slight dimple in the left cheek when the one on the right tried a cautious smile. For a moment, no one said anything. The storm roared behind them, but inside the doorway, there was complete silence. Evan felt as if the entire world had narrowed to just this moment, this image. These 2 boys staring up at him with expressions he couldn't yet decode. Finally, one of them spoke. "Are you Evan Carter?" His voice was small but clear. "Director." Evan's mouth was dry. "Yes," he said, barely recognizing the sound of his own voice. The second boy, slightly taller, stepped forward just half a pace. "We were told to find you." "Told by who?" Evan asked, his voice low, cautious. The boys exchanged a look. Then the first one spoke again, his eyes never leaving Evan's. "Our mom." That word hit him harder than thunder. He opened the door wider, stepping aside instinctively, as if guided by something older than logic. "Come inside," he said quietly. They stepped over the threshold. The moment they crossed it, water pooled around their shoes, soaking into the expensive tile. Evan didn't care. He shut the door behind them and turned slowly. The boys stood there awkwardly in the grand entryway, dripping, their eyes darting over the chandelier, the spiral staircase, the polished surfaces, all of it unfamiliar, intimidating. "You're wet. Let me get you towels," Evan muttered, his mind spinning. He walked toward the guest bathroom and returned with 2 thick towels, handing them wordlessly to the boys. They dried their faces, arms, hair. Still, they didn't speak. Evan crouched down slowly in front of them, his voice gentle now. "What's your name?" "Luke," said the taller one. "Logan," added the other. "Twins, of course. And your mother's name?" A pause. "Julia," Luke said softly. And suddenly the world tilted. A name from another life. A name he hadn't spoken out loud in years, but that now slammed into his chest like a wave. Julia, the barista with the bright blue eyes. The woman he'd had a brief, sweet, intense romance with in another lifetime. The one he'd left, unintentionally, abruptly, when duty pulled him across the world for a deal that changed his career. He stared at them, blinking hard, unable to form the next question, because the answer was already obvious. They weren't like him. They were his blood, his sons, and no one had told him. Luke stepped forward, something brave flickering in his expression. "She's sick," he said quietly. "Really sick. She told us the truth a few weeks ago. She said, you didn't know." Evan's breath caught in his throat. Logan's voice trembled. "She said you were a good man, that maybe you'd want to meet us, that you might help." The storm outside raged on, but inside Evan's house, and inside Evan's heart, a different kind of storm had begun. Everything he thought he knew about his life, everything he thought was behind him, had just walked through his door in the form of 2 scared, soaking wet boys. And nothing was ever going to be the same again. Evan sat at the edge of the long velvet couch in the living room, leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, his fingers tightly interlaced. Across from him, on the other side of the wide coffee table, sat Luke and Logan, wrapped in warm, dry blankets that nearly swallowed their small frames. Their hair was still damp, their sneakers resting by the fireplace where Evan had set them to dry. But their eyes, those mirrored brown eyes, stayed fixed on him with a strange combination of caution, curiosity, and something else he couldn't yet name. The fireplace crackled softly. Outside, the storm hadn't let up. Rain beat against the glass like nature itself was demanding to be heard. But inside the house, it was silent. Too silent. Evan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Every sentence felt like a canyon he couldn't cross. What do you say to two 11-year-olds who just showed up at your door and called you their father? It was Logan who finally broke the silence. She said you didn't know about us. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain, but there was no anger in it, just a child trying to understand the world. Evan cleared his throat, finally finding the strength to speak. I didn't, he said softly. I swear to you, I didn't. If I had known... We believe you, Luke interrupted, surprising Evan with how certain he sounded. Mom told us. She said it wasn't your fault. You had to go. She didn't tell you because it all happened so fast. Evan leaned back slowly, stunned by how the memories were beginning to come back, unearthing themselves after years of being buried under board meetings and quarterly reports. He remembered Julia. He remembered the coffee shop, that narrow, quiet place tucked between a bookstore and a florist in downtown San Francisco. She worked there every morning, always wearing a navy blue apron, her name stitched over her heart. Her eyes were impossible to forget, blue like sunlight through ice. She used to give him free extra shots of espresso. They joked, they flirted. One day he asked her out. It hadn't been a long affair. A handful of dates, a few passionate nights and mornings filled with laughter and fresh coffee. But there had been something there, something real. Then the deal happened. The one that launched his company into the international spotlight. A European acquisition, 6 months of travel, 0 downtime. He hadn't even said goodbye properly. One day he was in Julia's arms. The next he was on a plane to Berlin with 4 suitcases and an ocean between them. And now... You were born after I left? Evan asked, his voice tentative. Luke nodded. A few months later. She tried to write to you, but she didn't know where to send anything. She didn't know how to reach you. She thought about trying again, Logan added. But then your company got big. Really big. She didn't want to mess up your life. Evan shook his head, emotion rising in his chest like a tide. She wouldn't have messed up anything. I would have come back. I would have done anything. There was so much he didn't know. So much time lost. How long have you known about me? He asked quietly. Since we were little, Luke replied. But she only told us the full truth a few weeks ago. She got sick, Logan said, his voice even smaller now. Her heart. Something's wrong with it. She said she might not have much time. Evan went still. What kind of sick? He asked. Luke pulled a folded paper out of his backpack. Medical records, handwritten notes, contact information. Evan reached for it with trembling fingers. As he read, his face paled. He didn't understand all the medical terminology, but a few words stood out like warnings. Heart failure, transplant list, congestive, critical. She needs a new heart, Logan said. The doctor said she might not make it to the top of the list in time. And you came to me because she told you I might be able to help? Luke nodded again. Not just with money or anything. She said you had a right to know, that we had a right to find you, before it's too late. Evan felt the room tilt again. His mind spun, searching for something solid. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals, stood before entire boards of directors without flinching. But now staring at these 2 brave kids, his sons, he felt more uncertain than he ever had in his life. Where is she now? He asked, standing suddenly. Still in San Francisco, Luke said. General Hospital. We came straight from there. Evan grabbed his phone and began typing something. He didn't know what. Hospital contacts, private doctors, emergency protocols. He was already making plans, calling favors, organizing action. Then he paused, looked at the boys. You shouldn't have come alone, he said. You're just kids. We had to, Luke said simply. She couldn't, and we didn't know who else to trust. Evan knelt in front of them, his voice rough. You did the right thing. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. But I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. Logan looked at him for a long moment, then said something so quiet it almost got lost in the crackle of the fire. "Do you really want us?" Evan's chest tightened. He put his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "I've never wanted anything more." And in that moment, for the first time in his life, Evan Carter wasn't a CEO or a millionaire or a tech mogul. He was just a father, standing in front of the sons he never knew he had, ready to fight for the woman they all loved. And it had only just begun. The next morning, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a glistening, rain-soaked world and a city washed clean. But inside Evan Carter's home, the emotional weight from the night before still lingered thick in the air like fog refusing to lift. He hadn't slept. Neither had Luke or Logan. At some point after midnight, the boys had curled up on the oversized sectional in the living room, blankets wrapped around them, their heads touching as they finally gave in to exhaustion. Evan had sat in the armchair across from them the entire night, watching their small, peaceful forms, his mind a chaotic storm of guilt, questions, and the overwhelming instinct to protect. He had sons. That truth now pulsed through his bloodstream like electricity. Every time he looked at them, it hit him again, full force. 11 years. 11 years of birthdays he missed, bedtime stories, first words, first steps, soccer games, homework, laughs, tears. He hadn't been there for any of it, and it tore something inside him. But there was no time for self-pity. Not now. Julia was in a hospital bed, alone and dying, and he had no idea just how bad it had gotten. Evan made a few quiet phone calls just after sunrise. Discreet, private, effective. By 8:30 a.m., his black SUV was waiting in the driveway with a private physician, Dr. Sloan, seated beside him. The man was in his late 50s, one of the best cardiologists in California, flown in via red-eye from Los Angeles the moment Evan had called. When money was no object, time bent to your will. But this wasn't about power. This was about desperation. The boys were already up and dressed by the time Evan returned to the foyer. Luke wore a navy hoodie and Logan had changed into a t-shirt that still hung slightly too large. Clothes Evan's assistant had overnighted to the house. Despite everything, they stood straight, like they were trying to be brave. That alone broke Evan's heart more than any silence could. "We're going to see her?" Logan asked, his eyes wide with cautious hope. "Yes," Evan said. "Right now. And we're bringing help." The ride to the hospital was quiet. Evan sat between the boys in the back seat, their shoulders gently touching his. He kept glancing down at them, still half unable to believe they were real. But they were. They were his. San Francisco General Hospital loomed gray and impersonal when they arrived. A place designed to save lives but incapable of comfort. Evan hated it on sight. He guided the boys in through the sliding doors, Dr. Sloan striding ahead with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen death and stared it down more than once. The elevator ride to the cardiac wing was tense. Luke clutched the strap of his backpack. Logan looked down at his shoes. Evan placed a hand on each of their backs, a silent promise. "I'm here. I'm not letting you face this alone." When they reached her room, the nurse at the station gave Evan a hesitant look. She didn't recognize him. But Dr. Sloan intervened quickly, flashing his credentials and murmuring something that made her eyes widen. She buzzed them in without another word. The room smelled of antiseptic and quiet fear. Julia lay pale and still against a stack of white pillows, her once vibrant skin now a shade too close to porcelain. Her dark hair was swept back, and a thin oxygen line curved around her cheeks and into her nose. Machines beeped softly beside her, measuring the unsteady rhythm of a failing heart. She looked smaller than he remembered. Fragile. But even now she was beautiful. "Mom!" Logan's voice cracked as he stepped forward. Julia's eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened. For a long moment her gaze went to the boys, and a soft smile touched her lips. "You made it," she whispered. Luke was already at her side, gripping her hand. "We found him. We found Dad." Julia blinked slowly, confused at first. Then her gaze shifted, past the boys toward the tall figure standing in the doorway. Evan. Her eyes widened just slightly, blue and sharp even in her weakened state. "I wasn't sure if you'd come," she breathed. Evan stepped forward slowly, cautiously, as if he were afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. His voice was rough when he spoke. "I came the moment I knew." She tried to sit up, but a sharp breath stopped her. Evan was instantly at her side, helping support her shoulders as gently as he could. You shouldn't. Don't overdo it, he said. Just rest. Her hand trembled as she reached for his. He took it, their fingers lacing together like they had all those years ago over a cup of morning coffee neither of them had ever finished. I didn't tell you. I couldn't, she said. You left so fast. I didn't want to burden you with... Stop, he said, his voice thick. You were never a burden. If I had known, Julia, I would have been there. I would have helped you. I would have helped them. A tear slid down her cheek. I just didn't want them to grow up in the shadow of your world. All the pressure, the media, everything. I don't care about any of that, Evan said. I care about you, about them, about fixing this. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs, I will find a way. Dr. Sloan stepped forward quietly and gestured for Evan to step outside for a moment. Reluctantly, Evan squeezed Julia's hand, kissed her knuckles, and followed him into the hallway. She's in critical condition, Sloan said in a low voice. Advanced dilated cardiomyopathy. She needs a transplant. Urgently. I'll get her evaluated for a priority spot on the transplant list, but we're going to need to move fast. She has days, maybe a couple of weeks. Evan's stomach turned. Do whatever it takes, he said. Sloan nodded. We'll try. Evan turned back toward the room, looking through the small window in the door. Luke and Logan sat on the edge of the bed, each holding one of their mother's hands, whispering things he couldn't hear. He swallowed the lump in his throat. He had spent years chasing power, success, and legacy, thinking he was alone, thinking the emptiness inside him was the cost of ambition. But it wasn't empty anymore, and he would move heaven and earth to keep it that way. Back at the house, something had shifted. The grand halls of Evan Carter's once silent mansion now echoed with the unmistakable sounds of life. Footsteps running down the corridor, the dull thump of a basketball bouncing inside the foyer, the muffled giggles of two boys discovering corners of a house that hadn't seen joy in years. And Evan, for the first time in what felt like forever, wasn't annoyed by the noise. He welcomed it, relished it. Every laugh, every shout, every innocent question reminded him what he'd been missing. Not something small, but everything. He was still reeling from the visit to the hospital. Julia's fragile condition haunted his thoughts. The vision of her pale against the white pillows, the way her hand trembled in his, the way she smiled despite the pain. It lived behind his eyes like a permanent imprint. But the boys were here now, and they needed him, not just as a man who could make phone calls and throw money at doctors. They needed a father. That idea, father, was still new to him, strange, raw, but it was no longer just a word. It had become an identity that was claiming him from the inside out. He found Luke and Logan in the media room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, debating over which movie to put on. When they saw him, they both looked up, expressions hopeful but unsure, like they weren't yet convinced he wanted them here. Not really. Everything okay with Mom? Luke asked. Evan nodded, forcing a smile. She's stable. We're doing everything we can. I'm bringing in specialists tomorrow, top of their fields. Logan fidgeted with the TV remote. She's strong, he said, not looking up. She always gets better. Evan didn't contradict him, not because it was true, but because in that moment, hope was more important than truth. Are you hungry? Evan asked suddenly, needing to do something for them. Starving, they said in unison, their eyes lighting up just a bit. In the kitchen, Evan realized with mild embarrassment that he had no idea how to cook anything more complex than toast. His private chef usually handled everything, but he'd sent the staff home the night before, wanting space to think. He opened the fridge, then the freezer, then stared blankly. You guys like pancakes for dinner? He asked. Best idea ever, Logan declared. 15 minutes later, the three of them stood around the gleaming marble island in the kitchen. Batter splattered across the counter, flour dusting the sleeves of Evan's once pristine dress shirt. Luke was in charge of the chocolate chips. Logan handled the mixing bowl. Evan manned the stove, badly. The first pancake was a disaster. The second was slightly less embarrassing. By the fourth, they had a rhythm, and laughter began to replace uncertainty. Logan told a joke so bad Evan nearly dropped a spatula. Luke showed him how to flip with a wrist flick. I didn't know millionaires made pancakes, Luke teased. I didn't know millionaires could burn pancakes, Logan added, grinning. Evan pretended to look offended. Hey, I'm learning. Fast. The boys sat at the island, mouths full, faces happy, and Evan stood across from them with a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't thinking about earnings reports or tech launches or international partnerships. He was thinking about maple syrup on faces, the way Luke's laugh sounded like Julia's, the subtle way Logan leaned closer when he was comfortable. He was thinking about family. Later that night, as the boys settled into the guest room, converted hastily into something resembling a child's bedroom, with help from overnight deliveries and a frantic phone call to an assistant who thought she'd heard everything. Evan stood in the hallway outside, listening to them talk in hushed voices. They're going to be okay, Luke whispered. He's not like I thought. He's better. He's not what I expected either, Logan murmured. But I think Mom was right. I think he's good. Evan swallowed the lump in his throat. He turned and quietly made his way down the hall, into his study, closing the door behind him. For the first time in years, the photographs on his shelves bothered him. Award ceremonies, shareholder events, fancy galas, smiling strangers with name tags. No family, no love. He pulled open the bottom drawer of his desk and dug out an old box, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside were scraps of his old life, a business card from that coffee shop, a photo Julia had once texted him of herself with a ridiculous foam mustache from a cappuccino, a note scribbled on a napkin. Next time, try the hazelnut blend. Tubmar J. He stared at it for a long time, then carefully placed it on the desk beside him. He pulled out his phone and sent a message to his lawyer. He wasn't just going to visit the boys. He wasn't just going to support Julia through this. He was going to claim them. Officially, fully. He was going to fight like hell for all of them. Because being a father wasn't something that just happened. It was something you became, moment by moment, pancake by pancake, promise by promise. And Evan Carter was finally ready to become one. The call came just after midnight. Evan had barely closed his eyes, still in his clothes from the day, lying sideways across the bed with his phone resting on the nightstand like a live wire. He didn't even remember falling asleep, if he had at all. His dreams, or perhaps his racing thoughts, had been a blur of hospital monitors. Julia's pale face, the boys' voices calling for their mom, and the growing dread that time was running out faster than they could keep up. The vibrating hum of the phone jolted him upright. He grabbed it without hesitation. "This is Dr. Sloan," came the voice on the other end. Calm, measured, but edged with urgency. "We just received word from the donor registry. A heart has become available." For a few seconds, Evan could only hear his own breathing. Then the words crashed into him like a wave he didn't know how to brace for. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice raw with disbelief. "Yes," Sloan said. "It's a viable match. Not a perfect one, but close enough to proceed. It's from a 32-year-old male, brain dead from a motorcycle accident in Sacramento. The heart is healthy. We have a narrow window. I've already activated the transplant team. We're prepping Julia for surgery now." Evan was on his feet before the doctor finished speaking, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. He didn't bother changing clothes. He ran down the hallway barefoot and burst into the boys' room. Luke and Logan sat up immediately, eyes wide, sensing from the look on his face that something important had happened. "It's time," Evan said, breathless. "They found a heart for your mom. She's going into surgery." Logan gasped. "Now?" Evan nodded. "Get dressed. Let's go." They were out the door within minutes, the SUV speeding through the empty city streets, headlights carving a path through the dark. No one spoke much during the drive, the tension in the car thick, sacred. Evan's hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. In the rearview mirror, he kept catching glimpses of the boys, their small faces pale, lips pressed into nervous lines, holding back the storm of fear he knew must be clawing inside them. When they arrived at the hospital, the cardiac floor was lit up and alive with motion. Nurses moved swiftly through the hallways, doors swung open and shut, voices murmured in clipped, efficient tones. The scent of antiseptic was sharper tonight, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves knew this night was different. Dr. Sloan met them at the entrance to the surgical wing. "She's being prepped now," he said. "The team is ready. We'll begin as soon as the heart arrives by helicopter. ETA 15 minutes. Can we see her? Luke asked. Sloane hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Just for a minute. They led the boys to a private pre-op room where Julia lay beneath a warm blanket, her face even paler than before, but her eyes open. She looked tired, not the kind of tired that comes from lack of sleep, but the kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. But when she saw the boys and Evan behind them, something in her eyes brightened. She reached out both hands and Luke and Logan ran to her instantly, each taking one. "You came," she whispered. "We're here, Mom," Logan said, his voice cracking. "They found a heart." "I know," she murmured. "I heard." Evan stepped closer and she looked up at him. Her voice softened to something almost too fragile. "I didn't think I'd get this chance." "You're going to make it," Evan said, forcing certainty into his voice. "You'll come back to them. You'll come back to me." A nurse appeared in the doorway, giving them a gentle nod. It was time. Julia looked at her sons, her eyes filling with tears. "I love you. Always, no matter what." "We love you more," Luke whispered. And then she looked at Evan. "Take care of them," she said. "Don't let them feel alone. Not even for a second." "You have my word," he said. They watched as the team wheeled her away, her hand releasing theirs only at the last possible moment. And then she was gone behind the heavy doors, swallowed by the corridor that led to the operating room. Time lost all meaning after that. The boys curled up on the waiting room couch, wrapped in hospital blankets, drifting in and out of sleep. Evan sat upright in the corner chair, staring at the same spot on the tile floor, unmoving. Hours passed. He refused coffee, refused food. Every second that ticked by felt like its own battle. At some point, a nurse came by with updates. The heart had arrived. The surgery was underway. The team was working carefully. No complications yet. Evan held his breath through every update, fearing that one word, complication, rejection, failure, that might shatter everything. But that word never came. 7 hours after Julia was wheeled into surgery, Dr. Sloane emerged from behind the double doors. His scrubs were stained, his eyes exhausted. But his smile was unmistakable. "She made it," he said. Evan stood, unable to believe it. "The heart is functioning well. The transplant was clean. She's stable. She'll sleep for a while, but she's going to live." A sound escaped Evan's throat, half a sob, half a laugh. The boys stirred at the commotion, blinking awake. "She's okay?" Luke asked, stumbling toward him. "She's okay," Evan said. "She's going to be okay." They wrapped their arms around him, the three of them clinging together in the middle of the waiting room. No longer strangers, no longer unsure of one another. Just a father and his sons holding on to the miracle that had just been handed to them. And somewhere, deep in Evan's chest, beneath the suit, beneath the CEO, beneath the armor of years spent alone, something cracked open. And for the first time in his life, he knew what it meant to be whole. The sun had just begun to rise when Julia opened her eyes. Soft golden light spilled through the wide windows of her recovery room, casting long shadows across the floor and warming the sterile white walls with a gentle, forgiving glow. The steady beeping of monitors formed a quiet rhythm around her. No longer an ominous warning, but a steady heartbeat, a signal of life pushing forward. Evan was already there. He had barely slept, maybe an hour at most, curled awkwardly in a hospital chair next to her bed, his chin resting on his chest. The dark circles under his eyes were new, and his usually pristine appearance was replaced by rumpled clothes, untamed stubble, and the undeniable expression of someone who had carried the weight of the world on his back, and had finally set it down. Julia stirred, a small sound escaping her throat. Her fingers twitched against the blanket. Evan was awake instantly. "Hey," he said softly, leaning forward, eyes wide as they locked with hers. "You're awake." She blinked, her eyes dry and heavy. "Did it work?" He laughed. Not a loud laugh, but the kind that bubbled up out of sheer relief, full of emotion he hadn't had the strength to release until now. "It worked," he said. "You made it. You're going to be okay." Her gaze searched his face as if trying to read between his words. She lifted a hand, slowly, weakly, and he caught it in his. Her skin was warm now, not icy like before. "I was so sure I wouldn't wake up," she whispered. You did, Evan said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. You fought. You held on. You're here. Tears welled in her eyes, and this time, she didn't blink them away. How long has it been? She asked. About 8 hours since surgery. They've got you on a bunch of meds, but the doctors are optimistic. Dr. Sloan said your body's responding beautifully. Julia exhaled, the tension melting from her shoulders. And the boys? They're okay. They're with my assistant right now. I made sure they got real food and sleep, but they've been asking for you. Constantly. I want to see them. You will, he promised. Very soon. Let them rest a little longer. You need to, too. There was a pause, long and full of everything that hadn't been said. Years of distance, a lifetime of what-ifs, 1,000 questions that would take time to answer. Julia studied him, her voice barely above a whisper. Why did you come, Evan? Not just for them. For me. After all this time? He looked down at their hands, her fingers resting in his palm like something fragile, like something that had always belonged there. Then he met her eyes. Because I never forgot you, he said. Not for a second. I buried it. You, that time in my life. Because I thought it was over. But it never was. And when I saw those boys at my door, when I realized what I'd missed, everything changed. Julia was silent, her eyes glistening. I can't change the past, he continued, but I can show up now. I can stay. If you'll let me. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached up and touched his cheek, a small, slow movement that held years of memory in it. And then she nodded. You're here now. That's what matters. Just then, the door creaked open, and two familiar figures peeked in. Luke and Logan stood in the hallway, hesitant, as if afraid to break the fragile peace in the room. Evan waved them in. Julia's face lit up completely when she saw them. It wasn't just the smile, it was in her whole body, in the way her eyes sparkled, the way she tried to sit up straighter, even though her strength hadn't returned yet. Mom, Logan whispered, rushing to her side. Luke wasn't far behind. They each grabbed one of her hands, their heads dipping to her shoulders, the blankets wrinkling as they climbed onto the edge of the bed. You look okay, Luke said breathlessly. You look really okay. Julia laughed, a sound full of life that filled the room with something radiant. I am okay, she said. Thanks to you. Both of you. They clung to her, talking all at once, about the pancakes, about the hospital waiting room, about how Evan let them stay up late and showed them the big TV. It was chaos and it was joy, and it was healing in its purest form. Evan stood back watching them. His chest ached, but not in the way it once did. Not the hollow ache of loneliness, but something new, something warm, full. This was what he had been missing all along. Not just a woman or children or love, but a reason, a purpose, a future that didn't revolve around balance sheets or quarterly goals, but around dinners, birthdays, school events, morning hugs, inside jokes. He stepped forward finally, brushing Luke's hair with his hand, squeezing Logan's shoulder gently. Julia looked up at him, then at the boys, and she whispered, We're a family now. Evan nodded, voice thick. Yes, we are. And in that sunlit hospital room, surrounded by machines and wires and soft beeping monitors, the four of them sat together. Not as survivors of a crisis, not as strangers thrown together by chance, but as something new, something whole, something that was finally beginning. The house felt different now. It wasn't just the sound, though that had changed, too. Laughter echoed down the halls. Music played in the kitchen. Conversations floated up the staircase. But the biggest change wasn't what you could hear. It was what you could feel. There was warmth in every room. Evan stood at the window of his once lonely study sipping coffee, not from a sleek machine serviced by an assistant, but from a mug Luke had made at school, slightly crooked and painted with uneven streaks of green and blue. It had the word Dad written across it in big blocky letters. A few months ago, that word would have felt foreign. Now it was who he was, fully, proudly. Behind him, the sound of footsteps thundered down the stairs. Dad! Logan yelled. Luke's hogging the cereal again. I am not, Luke's voice followed quickly. I just poured a fair amount. Evan smiled into his mug and turned to meet them. They crashed into the room like a wave, both in pajamas, hair wild and voices raised. each trying to out-explain the other. He didn't say anything for a second, just watched them, full of life, of personality, of his features in miniature form. And he still marveled at the idea that they were real, that they were here, that he hadn't dreamed them up on one of those long, lonely nights when he used to stare out over the city, wondering what was missing. All right, he said, holding up his hands. Cease fire. I'll make pancakes. They stopped bickering instantly. Luke lit up. With chocolate chips? Logan's eyes went wide. And bananas? Evan laughed. You got it. In the kitchen, Julia stood near the counter, wearing one of his button-down shirts over leggings, her long dark hair pulled into a loose braid, a mug in her hands. Not coffee, but tea the way she always liked it. Her cheeks were pink with color again, her posture stronger. The way she leaned casually against the marble island, watching her family, it was easy to forget that just months ago, she had hovered on the edge of death. Now she was glowing with life. She caught his gaze and smiled, soft and knowing. He walked over, placing a hand gently on her lower back, and she leaned into his touch. I think I'm finally getting the hang of this, he said quietly. Pancake diplomacy, she teased. No, he said. All of it. This. Us. Julia looked at the boys who were already setting the table, Logan placing napkins, Luke pouring juice with exaggerated care, and nodded. Me too. Later that morning, after breakfast and the cleanup that felt more like a comedy routine than a chore, the four of them piled into the SUV and drove down to the park near the bay. The fog was lifting, revealing a clear blue sky over the Golden Gate. Tourists wandered with cameras, but Evan didn't notice them anymore. The world used to be made of schedules and silence. Now it was made of moments like this. Luke racing ahead with a soccer ball, Logan calling after him, Julia laughing as Evan tried to keep up. They ended up on a picnic blanket, lying in the grass while the boys ran wild nearby. I talked to my lawyer, Evan said, resting on one elbow beside her. Julia turned to him, raising a brow. That sounds ominous, he smiled. No prenup, no business deal. I just had the adoption paperwork finalized. Her eyes widened slightly. I didn't want them to wait any longer. They're mine in every way that matters. I just wanted to make it legal. Julia reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in the space between them. You didn't have to do that for me. I didn't, he said. I did it for them. And for me. They were quiet for a long moment, watching the boys wrestle in the grass, laughing so loudly people turned their heads. I was scared, Julia admitted. After the surgery, when I woke up, I didn't know if you'd stay. I was scared too, he said. Not of leaving, of being too late. She laid her head on his shoulder, and for a while they just sat like that, in silence, surrounded by the ordinary magic of the day. That evening, back at the house, Luke and Logan were in their pajamas, sprawled across the living room rug with a board game between them. The fireplace flickered low. Music played softly from the speakers. Evan brought in popcorn and set it on the table, only to be immediately dragged into a debate over the game's rules. Julia leaned in the doorway, watching the three of them. A man who had once been a stranger to her sons, now laughing and arguing over dice rolls like he'd been there all along. She walked in, curled up beside them, and the game continued. Louder, messier, more joyful. At one point, Logan reached out and wrapped an arm around Evan's shoulders, not saying anything, just leaning in. Evan froze for a second, startled by the gesture, then rested his own arm around the boy's back. And in that moment, he knew, truly knew, what happiness felt like. Not the fleeting kind that came from success or money or winning, but the kind that came from belonging, from love, from being exactly where you're meant to be. They hadn't planned to become a family, but life had knocked on Evan Carter's door one stormy night, and he had opened it. And thank God he did. Here's my personal author's perspective on the ending of the story. The ending isn't just a happy conclusion. It's a quiet victory over loneliness, ego, and fear. It's a story about a man who built his world on logic, control, and success, only to be blindsided by the one thing he never planned for: family, blood, love, vulnerability. Evan Carter starts off as the classic millionaire in a glass tower, powerful, respected, but utterly alone. Then fate knocks on his door, quite literally in the form of two boys with his eyes and a truth that upends everything. And in that pivotal moment, he makes the most human choice of all. He opens the door. What follows isn't a fairy tale. It's not neat or perfect. It's raw, painful, full of guilt and learning. And that's exactly what makes the ending so powerful. It's earned. Evan doesn't get redemption by writing a check or making one grand gesture. He earns it by showing up every single day for people he barely knew, but came to love with his whole heart. I especially appreciate how the story doesn't force drama for the sake of it. It lets the emotion breathe. There's fear, yes, and heartbreak, but there's also healing, not through miracles, but through commitment, warmth, pancakes, and quiet conversations. The love story here isn't just between a man and a woman. It's between a man and the life he never thought he'd be brave enough to want. In the end, this story reminds us that real wealth doesn't live in bank accounts or boardrooms. It lives in laughter echoing down a hallway, in small hands grabbing yours, in someone calling you dad for the very first time. And that's the kind of fortune you can't put a price on.